Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 11 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, but most importantly, I am an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically behind how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long term for the long game towards a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and dig that little bit deeper. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players. And now we have over 30 episodes to date, which is so exciting. Today's topic plays its own role, like so many other episodes, in developing the player, parent to coach for that road ahead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So look, as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today. Look, if this is your first time joining us, thank you so much. But look, if you've been with us from the beginning, boy, you know what we're all about and how far we've come. So thank you so much for sticking with us. As has, I guess, become custom, we really like just diving in deeper and sharing those additional insights. And I think today's episode, it's a little bit of a piggyback of our previous episodes. And I say that in respect to, I think, that planning and how we've touched on periodization, because today's topic, and look, if you want to follow along, we're on page 192, and it is why are the top players dropping like flies? Periodization. And I won't, I'll share some additional insights before we dig into that chapter. But I'm going to, I guess, date the episode in this respect because the US Open is on at the moment. It's the first week. So if you happen to listen to this episode not within this period, I do encourage you to have a little bit of a rewind. So have a look, I think, at the players, the rankings, the active ones, and as the title shares, dropping like flies. So those who have fallen early, for example. And obviously those records are easily available. But if you're listening obviously now, within the span, I guess, of the last couple of weeks when this has come out, and then you'll probably, I think what I'm about to share will be more so front and center, so you won't have to backtrack in that respect. So specifically, it's what the results are showing us. Now a lot of my books that obviously come after the secrets to optimal performance success that are set on those performance metrics. So that's specifically, what is your game missing? What is your game missing now? And what is your game missing to win? And look, one of those books was actually voted the #1 book to read worldwide when it came out, which is incredibly exciting. But what the pretense of this is about is that they looked at specific players inside, whether it's a top 10, but there was a certain threshold. So the books vary, so they had to make, say, the round of 16, quarterfinals, etc. And essentially looks at those metrics. So if you're one of those players that has advanced to the round of 16, for example, at a Grand Slam within the last couple of years, then I do encourage you to take a look. If you do have a player that you are looking at progressing to that level at a Grand Slam, of course I encourage you to have a look, because it sets the scene and breaks down specific behaviors from that, I think, that technical perspective that showcases what it really takes to not only just win a Grand Slam and then obviously advance to the championships, but specifically also what sets players apart that are capable of winning more than one Grand Slam. And why am I bringing this up, or what's the relevance? Now, the relevance here, obviously, how it tracks back to, why a player's dropping like flies, is because there are certain players that this does not happen to. They're able to maintain their performance. And how I'm dating this episode is it's obviously the first week of the US Open, and the date is obviously going to show this, but specifically what we're talking about is we've had top 10 players lose in the first to second rounds on both the WTA and ATP's tours, and more than one. So it's not just a singular player in this respect. So the cause for concern here, look, on one side, it's really not surprising because the US Open is the last Grand Slam of the season. And typically, if you have not followed that periodization to a T at this level, this is bound to happen. It is absolutely bound to happen because more often than not, you're overworked. You've done too much and your body is saying, hey, I need that time to rest. Others, though, are able to maintain a certain level of play because their periodization is so on cue. So what I mean by that, it really factors in those peak performance cycles. Now, I've touched on this in our previous episode and also the accompanying blogs, but I'll dive in a little bit deeper. So for those of you who are not familiar with the previous episode and or have not had the chance to obviously catch up on those blogs, but I do encourage you to do so, please. So what this really talks about is the planning that's in peaks. So if I use the 4 Grand Slams, obviously every season that happen as an example, that would mean 4 specific peak performances per season. But we all know that there are bigger events between these Grand Slams. So your periodization, so that chart work and that planning that goes in throughout these different periods, we're looking at anywhere from 8 upwards to 16. It really varies, which is an extraordinary amount, and I would discourage that, because if we're looking at a calendar that's roughly 11 months in duration, 10 to 11 months, because typically December is a lull. However, that lull in December typically has a lot of work involved. So pre-season for obviously January for the Australian Open. And when we're saying that, really that off time is a lot of hard work. Obviously, some players have more time than others, but when I think we're specifically looking at the top 10 who have those season-ending championships typically later towards the year. Ideally, let's say it's around that October, November mark. Now, I don't obviously have those dates front and center, but I'm sure you're following along in this respect. So these are just estimates or approximations when we're referring to those peak performances, those cycles, and I think the distance between. So, and when we say distance, the time frames between, and a lot of planning goes into place and is absolutely fundamental to maintain a certain level, but also it's absolutely critical to mitigate injuries. Though on the flip side as well, if your technical parameters are off, those injuries are going to happen regardless, unfortunately. And what I mean by that is that, look, your elbow could be, that angle could be a little bit too high, and that over and over and over, obviously throughout a season, that elbow is going to almost jar to an extent over hundreds, if not thousands of times, because think about how many tennis balls you hit within that period. Obviously, it's incredibly significant, but that's not essentially what we're focusing on. So we look at why players are dropping. Now, typically, for example, the US Open is probably it's one of my favorites in respect to also potentially the Australian Open, but more so I'll focus on the US Open because that's, I guess, the time of year. But we have seen so many new Grand Slam champions over the last couple of years who win their maiden slam at the US Open. And a lot of people are surprised by that. And the question really is that it's not really that surprising when you see how much work one of the elite players, so the top 10, have put in throughout the year. And when the US Open comes, it's so hard for them to maintain that level of play if adequate rest has not happened as and or when needed. So a couple of players come to mind, but I'm not going to name them, and you can have a look obviously at that honor roll, but and we'll be on the same page. But that we have a number of players who have gone on to not peak, which means they won a maiden slam at the US Open, and that has not been replicated at, let's say, the Australian Open or other Grand Slams where they've lost in the earlier rounds. And that's not so surprising because that was their absolute peak, that was their career peak, and they have not figured out how to replicate that. And when I mean they have not figured it out, because it was almost a shock, it was a surprise that they were able to peak to that level because it actually was not planned. Now, by all means, this can happen, and it's phenomenal and wonderful, everything. It is obviously the pinnacle of a player's career. Though the heartbreaking part is, of course, you want to be able to replicate that. But you need to backtrack to go, how did this happen? What planning do I need to put in place to allow this? Now, more often than not, and it's happened to a couple of players who have won the US Open, for example, specifically on, actually it's both the women's and men's side. There's a handful of players that this has happened to. And they've been riddled with injuries soon after, and they've struggled to find that form. Also, though, this happens at the US Open. The Australian Open, because once they've peaked at the US Open and you are, say, a top 10 player and you've done really well, then all of a sudden the new year starts, so the new season starts, and their performance, it drops. And why? It's because the period of rest they've been able to have, it's not sufficient for the player to recover. And when I say it's not sufficient, it has not been planned for. It has the needs of that individual have not been accounted for in whatever levels of rest their body actually needs. Now, you need to remember that every player is going to be slightly different. Obviously, rest is rest, but obviously not every player makes it to the finals of a Grand Slam. Only 4 players per tour, so 8 in total, are going to make the semi-finals. Players that obviously lose earlier in the Grand Slams, they have up to, say, an additional 10, 12, 13 days for some off, which they can put towards, say, that active recovery, time off, etc. Whatever is, I think, specific for their planning. Now, the pretense, obviously, of today's episode is that why do they drop like flies? So obviously periodization it's huge. It is a big one, which again, written about, refer to like the blogs, the previous episodes. But what we really want to focus on here is the underlying reasons. Now, the planning has obviously gone into place, but when the US Open happens, it's not just physical, it's mental and emotional. So we look at the training that's been involved, but how exhaustive the season can be. Now, I'm probably all in favor of a shortened season because of this. And I say this because athletes become more susceptible to being derailed. Obviously, so their bodies are succumbing to some sort of injury. And it could be due simply because they're mentally exhausted. So errors happen and all of a sudden you have a sprain. But what we're talking about is that you have 2 Grand Slams, so specifically Wimbledon and the French, so close together. And you have a gap between the Australian and the French, and then all of a sudden the US Open hits. So you're after, when you go to the French, to Wimbledon, the US, you're after specific peaks within that 3 to 4 month time frame, which is very significant. It's a huge load on the player. The Australian, though, you have room to recover. However, there are substantial events leading up to the French where you do actually need to peak. Obviously, in an ideal world, you would separate that by 2 months, we could say. So 4 Grand Slams, 2 months, so over an 8-month period, and you're going for a peak, then drop, then peak, then drop, then peak, then drop, then peak, then drop. And then potentially that 10-month season is for the season ending championships. And then players are afforded that 2-month window to recover and to put in the hard work. That, from my perspective, evens out the playing field and obviously leaves athletes less susceptible to developing an injury and ample time to recover. Because we see one too many players, they withdraw from the Australian Open because they have not had adequate time to recover, or they withdraw from the US Open because they need that extra time. Now we go, well, we have an even playing field because everyone's exposed to the same demands, which is fair call and fair enough. Though specifically, you go, if you want to reach that peak, and if we're looking at periodization here, that chart work is incredibly demanding. And you can condition an athlete to an extent, but tennis has to be one of the longest seasons out there across the sporting world. And sure, I'm sure there are other sports similar, though tennis definitely has to be at the top when we're looking at the length of season, the length of recovery, which in some players' cases is less than a month. When you have tournaments late into November, if they are played, and then some that start late December. So it's being very mindful of when is that recovery period. Now, recovery for some could literally be 1 to 2 weeks. Now, when you're looking at a 52-week calendar, that's incredibly exhausting. But it also signals why that planning is absolutely critical when you have to be so on the money, so to speak, to be able to plan that accurately. And that is why you have the top 20, I'll say specifically, that they change, but there is a big, I think, period of when no change happens because of this. You wonder why at times all of a sudden a player progresses inside the top 20 and you go, where did they come from? Essentially, they've got fresh legs. They've got fresh legs and they can come up for air. The top 20 are not coming up for air in this respect. Though the same is true when a player overdoes themselves, and so they go from 80 to 60 to 40 and they keep progressing because they're bam, 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 bam. They're peaking, and they are progressing deep in tournaments, and then all of a sudden they get towards the top 20 and they regress because they're unable to sustain that level of play because they need that time off. It happens, I think, in different scenarios, and obviously there are variances there for respective players. Although once you get to the top and you figure out what works best for that athlete and you're able to maintain it, that's what separates the top 10 from the rest. Those that can sustain that. Now, I'm being a little bit cautious for how much I'm sharing here, because I think on a different point, there is a text that I'm actually working on as we speak that really unravels this further. So I want to give you enough, but at least hold you back a little bit to be curious for when that comes out. Though I think, look, if you want to follow along to get today, again, I think it's time that we dive in a bit to the chapter. And again, we are on page 192. So here we go. More often than not, we see a lot of the elite unprepared for the start of a new season. In contrast, the not quite elite appear better off and spared from succumbing to injury so early into the season. This unpreparedness is becoming more commonplace in the elite's saturated players for one simple reason: periodization. Now, this is a significant part and proves a big point here when we say the non-elite are prepared and the elite are unprepared, because of what I've just touched on, the amount of time the more elite player has to rest, and that's limited to that 4 to 6 week window, and that often that 4 to 6 week window is preseason. Now, I don't know any other sport that's preseason is that short for these players. It is incredibly small. However, you have the players who are not playing late into October, November, who do not make the cut for the season-ending championships. So their season finishes earlier. US Open is on at the moment, so I know I'm really dating today's episode, but it's going to finish mid-September. So some players are going to have the choice then for that 3 months, October, November up to December, off. And so their pre-season is lengthened. Now, for some of the elite, they're going to make the decision to end their season early. And there are already a handful of top 10 players, just a handful, who have not made the US Open or had lost early on in the US Open. And they have either chosen or will choose to lengthen that pre-season, so to have ample recovery to prepare for next year. And I know it's almost incredible that we're talking about the new season when essentially there's a quarter left. That's 25% left of this current season, but it just goes to show how long the season is and how exhaustive it can be if the right planning is not in place. So you have the more non-elite statured players who make it, who progress to the Australian Open. Now, I don't know, and I'm sure if you're listening, you can have a good peek. How many players have won their maiden slam also at the Australian Open? In this respect, you still have the elites, so the top 10s progressing at the Australian Open, but you also have those who have not had enough time off. Their pre-season was almost non-existent, and so they fall early in the Australian Open, which happens. And now I think it's fair to say this does happen all year round, but players are often more susceptible at this time of year when we're looking at the cause. And it's often because their season was too long and they haven't had enough time to recover and or put in the work with their pre-season to prepare for the new season. Now, if you're thinking about preparing for a new season with a 4 to 6 week window, it is so small, it's almost ironic from that perspective. Though, specifically for these players, I can name a handful who have peaked at the Australian Open. And oftentimes it's because they've taken that time off after the US Open. Typically they have not performed very well, so they have not peaked at the US Open, and so they want to work on peaking at the Australian Open. And we've had a handful of players who, yes, have won their maiden championships then at the Australian Open. So I think on one hand, you've had a player who have had a relatively mediocre year before they finally peak at the US Open. Otherwise, you have players who have had an okay year. They've had their peaks. They may have progressed to a quarters, the semi-finals, not quite found their rhythm. And then they've lengthened their pre-season by taking from, mid-September or September through to the end of the year off. And then finally you see that peak. And this happens all year round. These are just very good examples from end of season to the beginning of season, and we typically see this. Of course, we do see those progressions at the French Open to Wimbledon in different ways, and oftentimes you do have the top 10 players falling because they've been pushing themselves so much all year round. And again, the irony here, which is almost a theme of today's episode, is that when you're looking at specifically the elite of the elite, so the number ones, the number twos, the number threes in the world, so specifically the top fives, you will notice a consistent level that is able to be maintained throughout the season, but also more time off. No longer are players pressing themselves to go from one event to the next, to the next, to the next. Their periodization rings true, as in they stick to those periods where they have time off. Now, I've touched on this in a recent blog about sharing why this happens, and leading players, and I'll say from the Federers to the Serenas, who championed for that time off, where they reduced their schedules later on in their careers and reap the rewards. And now you see players who are not late in their careers, but they're reaping the rewards earlier by taking that time off. In all fairness though, these players are allowed to, because they're not defending specific points that are putting obviously their rankings in jeopardy, so it's very carefully planned. But you can also see why there are windows here for the lesser ranked players to progress through. Obviously, when the elites are taking that time off, it's an incredible time for players to look to progress. However, you really need to be mindful of that planning. Players who are top 400, top 300, top 200 in the world, and if you're listening, this is absolutely key, because you will most likely hover around the 200 to 100, still progressing slightly, but you will hover at a specific plateau if you're unable to get that planning right that works for you. Players who are unable to rely on direct gameplay and or tournament entry for performance success cannot rely on the same entry and continued play as the best players in their sport are afforded. The elite crop of players, individual and team-based, continuously push their bodies throughout the year, and thus their recovery, although planned, are afforded less margin for error and time. Strategically, planning in sync with the season is at times overlooked, in contrast to maintaining their game, match, tour presence. However, some players are consistently prepared. Why is this the case? Because of a coach's awareness of and implementation of periodization. All right, that was a lot there, but what I really want to tap on is the lower ranked players, so those who are not afforded the direct entry. So for those of you, this actually works in your favor, because if you are not afforded that direct entry, you're in the qualifying rounds, which means you are playing a week oftentimes earlier, and you're going from one event to the next to the next. Now, obviously, this is not sustainable all year round. You will succumb to an injury, and overtraining can come under that banner. Though what we're saying is that oftentimes you've got that match play where you are prepared. Unfortunately, typically if you get to the second, third round, that's equivalent to all of the matches that a player who's afforded direct entry and ends up winning the championship. So you need fresh legs in that respect. However, you are able to plan specifically your performance when you're going to peak to allow this to happen. You potentially will have a longer run to get past that third, fourth round if you're incredibly lucky, if your entire season has not been shaped this way. So again, you have planned for this. For those players who have had direct entry, so this is where you are incredibly fortunate in this respect. When you've worked so hard to progress towards the top 100, those Grand Slams, you're guaranteed that entry. And what this allows is that you do not necessarily have to play tournament after tournament after tournament. You want to look at peaking and progressing, and I guess that's part of the nature of the game, so the setup. Though if you do not still have that adequate time, you're still going to flop. So to the qualifiers out there, those ranked 300, 200 in the world who are looking to qualify, you do have an advantage if you use it to your disposal. Players ranked inside the top 100, you also have an advantage if the planning is there. So what I'm sharing is that irrespective of your ranking, if you plan correctly and specifically, you can even out the playing field. Now, when we're looking at the elites, so top 20, but specifically top 10, obviously the entry is guaranteed, but we're looking at the coach's level of awareness around that periodization. Now, obviously, tapped into this is obviously that awareness of the 7 keys that we've touched on. If not in all episodes, in most episodes. And obviously, if you want to, I think, catch up on the 7 keys, the resources are there. AMA International is there that really dives in deep in there. So obviously that level of awareness is ingrained, embedded in the 7 keys, which in turn allows an athlete to progress past that third, fourth round. And you know the players who have progressed to that round of 16 and further are incredibly conscious of this. And we see that correlation. And specifically the text that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, so the What is Your Game Missing series, so there's 3 texts there that's a look at the correlations, which again is a world first, which is incredibly cool and exciting that I've been behind to develop. And we can specifically look at a formula, if you like, and the underpinning theories that actually show when that player is going to peak, when and or if that player is poised to become a barrier breaker, if that player is set to win their maiden championship. Incredibly exciting and awesome and everything in that light, because I'm looking at the US Open and we know specific players who are set to progress. 2 of my favorites has to be Swiatek. So we knew she was set to win her maiden Grand Slam a couple of years ago when that happened. Alcaraz is another, because we knew because of his ascension that he was poised to win his maiden championship. We knew again a couple of years ago Osaka was set to win more than 1 Grand Slam after her US Open triumph when she went back-to-back to the Australian Open. So they're just a couple of examples when we're looking at the newcomers, if you like. And obviously none of those 3 players are newcomers anymore. They have secured their place inside the top 10. Obviously, for Osaka has had that time off, etc. We're not going into that, but we're looking at when we can look at those peaks when a player is going to reach that peak. Obviously, if injuries come about, that is outside, obviously, of the control, or outside of those metrics. But there are tools we can put in place to safeguard that, which those books do go into more detail. But one of the best ways to safeguard a player is by implementing periodization, by adopting it into your training. Because planning, and look, we like taking that humanized approach in every episode, and look, today's episode is about time, because that humanized approach, tennis players are human, we are all individuals, and planning in life and in tennis is incredibly important. Irrespective of what you're working towards, the planning is behind that. You have planned to achieve X, Y, Z. And so the same is again for that tennis player. If they're planning on ascending to the top 100, they're planning on playing these 6 events within this period, and they're looking to achieve these results, or they're planning to progress from a technical perspective and to be able to execute that new technique throughout play, to recondition and or condition and build that new habit. So we call that habitual state of play. Moving on. All right, here we go. A longer off-season affords lower-level ranked players a chance to not only build their playing base, but it allows them to strengthen their body, preparing for the season ahead. A shorter off-season needs to be more carefully planned. And this is what we've spoken about, is that lower-ranked players actually have an advantage here if it is planned correctly and if they are aware of the 7 keys. And I cannot stress that enough. We see players who have all of this time to prepare, but they are not privy to the 7 keys, which means if you want a head start and you want to progress into the top 100 and ascend closer and closer towards the top 10, the 7 keys have been found. And this is obviously backed by data, but 100% by science, to progress you towards that top 10 tennis ranking. I cannot stress that enough. For the player though who is ranked top 20 in the world and you want to become a barrier breaker, break into the top 10, the 7 keys are just as applicable, but they are even more amplified to make that transition. When we're looking at that player ranked 500 in the world who's looking at breaking into the top 100 within the next 2 to 3 seasons, slowly and steadily, the 7 keys, you will adopt them and get them ingrained into your game. So they will become second nature, a conditioned state of play, a habitual state of play to get you to that next level. Strength needs to be built whilst the player is afforded the chance to recover from the year that has just passed. Although recovery is essential at this time, players who are ill-prepared are a direct result of not planning their active recovery throughout the season. And this is why periodization is so important. And look, we've touched on that throughout today's episode, and we're going to finish on that because I cannot stress planning enough. And irrespective of what your ranking is, you still need that off time. More often than not, if you are have a lower rank, so you are in that, that 500, 300, 200 bracket, you do have ample time and your body is not conditioned yet to be at that peak level. It's obviously at that peak level for you, but is it at the peak level to sustain a top 10 level of play? Obviously not, because of your ranking and what it shows. So to reach that point, we still need to factor in those periods of rest. But by integrating the 7 keys and ingraining that, we're looking at progressing and the correlations that I've touched on earlier to get you there. And you need to allow yourself that time. So we're looking at that planning. And depending on what your current ranking is, it could be 1 season, 2, 3. So if you look at the long game, for a top 20 player to ascend into the top 10, that's a 1 to 2 seasons. If you're looking at that top 80 player, it increases. However, you can fast track that but it's all dependent on the 7 keys and your ability to implement these practices, which is incredibly exciting, incredibly rewarding, especially when we're looking at developing that top 10 tennis ranking. And thank you so much for listening today. I really wanted to wrap that up nice and quickly and pack it with a punch about the 7 keys. So now you can look at all the links in the episode notes and go, what are the 7 keys? I need to rehash the 7 keys. I need to just recap, and I need to look and work on my periodization and look at the blogs and look at last week's blogs as well. So we look into the archives, because today's episode, I can't stress this enough, and especially because it's the time of year where that last Grand Slam is on. And for some of you, if you're not actively playing or you've already lost in the earlier rounds, this is your chance. If you want to peak come the Australian Open, you want to use the next 3 months to reach that next peak performance. Now, the shortcut there is 7 keys, off season, planning, and you can progress. So it's all interconnected to reach that next marker. And obviously that next mark is that next peak performance. So I think you can see how I get really passionate about this, because my work is surrounded by this, and I want you to succeed. Irrespective if you are that player, that coach, that parent, I want you to be able to just harness those 7 keys, your full potential, so you can progress steadily towards that top 10 ranking, because I can't think of anything more exciting. To get your hands on the secrets to optimal performance success, head on over to AMA International. That is amainternational.com. You will also see the 7 keys there, and I will leave the links in the episode notes. Anything to do with your comments, your feedback, it is always incredibly welcome and appreciated. So please do leave that over on AMA International, or head to Topic Thread. That's the social platform set on data privacy, but also the only social network that I am on. However, beyond Top 10 Tennis is over on Twitter, Threads, LinkedIn to Instagram. So please come and say hi, and I will try my best to catch up on those comments. However, please feel free to leave them, and eventually, I promise, I will get back to you. To catch up on our weekly coaching tips, head on over to TikTok. So that's a bit of fun for you there, and please do say hi there as well. To catch up on our blogs, head on over directly to AMA International and look for our blog tab, or to Medium. And as always, I'll leave all of the links in the episode notes. There's something a little bit different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. And to view this week's question and polls, be sure to visit Spotify. Or for something different, or a bit left of field, visit Spruik, where we've got some random interactive polls. Again, I'll leave all of the links in the episode notes. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and all of the above would be absolutely phenomenal. Those of you who have, thank you so much. If this is your first time tuning in, please don't be shy. And for those of you who are interested, we do have scholarships available on AMA International, as well as options to work with me exclusively to optimize your performance and to nudge you close towards that top 10 tennis ranking. So don't be shy, come and say hi. And that is a shout out, I think, to all of the listeners. So you specifically, my sweet spot is top 20 players. If you're in the top 20 and you want to become a barrier breaker, come and say hi. However, you could be ranked currently top 500, 400 in the world. And if you really want to ascertain the 7 keys more specifically and more concisely, and you need help with that planning, come and say hi, because that's what we are there for. That's what AMA International has been built for. That's also why I am here. On that note, thank you so much for listening. I am so incredibly grateful. I'm your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.